Hello everyone and welcome to the launch of Napoleon 200. My name is James Bramble and I'm the Executive Director of the British Napoleonic Bicentenary Trust, a new charity that has been set up to commemorate, as the name suggests, the death of Napoleon on Saint Helena 200 years ago, on the 5th of May 1821. You might well ask why Napoleon's death still matters 200 years later. Today, we're going to explain why we think it does still matter. We will hear from some of our trustees and main supporters, either in person or via short recorded videos. Firstly, we will have a video message from Andrew Roberts, author of the best-selling biography, Napoleon the Great. We will then see short messages from His Excellency Philip Rushbrook, the Governor of Saint Helena, Michel d'Anquin Martineau, the Honorary French Consul of Saint Helena, and Kedal Warboys, representative of the Government of Saint Helena in the UK. So Brian Unwin, our Chair of Trustees, and Dan Cruickshank, who I'm sure you all know, are here and will explain a little bit more about Napoleon on Saint Helena. And finally, we will take questions from you all. Please can you type any questions into the chat box on the right of your screen at any time, and we will go through the presentation, and Alex, our social media manager, will collate these for our answers at the end. All the speakers will explain why Napoleon still matters in the 21st century, and why Napoleon on Saint Helena is still such an important and compelling episode in world history. Before we start, let me explain a little bit about what the Napoleon 200 campaign is. We have two main objectives: to preserve the built heritage of Saint Helena and to present new perspectives on the story of Napoleon on Saint Helena. Our main built heritage project is Toby's Cottage, a building at the Briars where Napoleon first stayed on the island, and which was the home of the slaves who worked there. The site has been donated by the French consul Michel d'Anquin Martineau, to whom we are very grateful and whom we'll hear from a little bit later. Dan Cruickshank will explain why we believe this building is also so important to Napoleon's story and the history of the island. The other heritage sites that we hope to preserve, with enough funding, are on our website at napoleon200.org, so please do have a look at that. To present new perspectives on the story of Napoleon, we will also launch an events programme with our partners and supporters. And I can announce that the first of these events will be at 6 p.m. on October the 29th, and will be a tour of Saint Helena in Napoleon's footsteps. Brent Fortenberry from Texas A&M University will show 3D models, the result of digital scanning with drones that he conducted on the island, of the main Napoleonic sites of Saint Helena, supported by colleagues from Oxford University. Please do put that in your diary now, 6 p.m. on October the 29th. Further events will be announced in due course, and we hope that these will include Napoleon on Saint Helena in art and literature, the history of slavery on Saint Helena, and even a discussion on whether Napoleon could ever have escaped the island. Please sign up to our mailing list if you have not already to receive invitations to these events at www.napoleon200.org. You can also make a donation, should you be kind enough to do so, to support our work on that website. Finally, in May, we will of course organise events to mark the bicentenary itself. These will include events at the graveside of many of the individuals who shared Napoleon's final years on Saint Helena, names that you will hear in the presentations today. These graves are mainly located in the UK and in France, where we're partnering with the Souvenir Napoleon. But we also hope to be organising events in the US, Australia, and Russia. So if you or anyone you know might be able to help, please do get in contact with me at james@napoleon200.org. Before I play Andrew Roberts' message, I would like to just finally thank those who have helped us get to this point. 3 months ago, this whole endeavour that we're announcing today was at significant risk of being cancelled due to COVID-19. It was the support and enthusiasm of our partners and supporters that made us stick to our plans. And today, I'm very glad that we did. There are many, many people to thank. The French consul, Michel Dancois-Martineau, for donating Toby's cottage. Brent Fortenbury at Texas A&M University for scanning the sites and producing the conservation management reports. Ollie Cox at Oxford Torch for all the support he has provided. Chris Dumas and Steve Barker at Avison Young, and Steve Webb and Callum Macmillan at Webb Yates for their work on costing the work to the sites. Initial work by Preston Starkey, Hockney and Dawson, and Sawyer and Fisher. Our fantastic trustees, not least, who are listed on our website. And many of you on this call from the heritage sector who have given me advice and support over the last year. There are many of you. I'm grateful to you all. I'm sorry I can't mention you all by name, but you know who you are. On that note, I'd like to show a short reel of messages of support before we introduce our first presentation by Sir Brian.
Hello. I'd like to start off by congratulating the British Napoleonic Bicentenary Trust for all the work it's doing on this tremendously important anniversary for Napoleon and Napoleonic studies. It strikes me that the Saint Helenan aspect of Napoleon, those last 5.5 or so years that he spent on the island, are an absolutely essential part of the Napoleonic ethic and the Napoleonic myth. And unless one appreciates that aspect, those last 5 years, I don't think you completely can grasp the concept. It really was an epic story. It was like something out of the Greek tragedies. The eagle chained to the rock in, of course, the Napoleonic myth-making, and something that really does go to the heart of what Napoleon was all about, even though, of course, he had been defeated in his 60th and last battle at Waterloo back in 1815. Those years between 1815 and 1821 strike me as being essential. Why? Partly, of course, because he was able to write his Memorial of Saint Helena there, his autobiography, which became the biggest bestseller of the 19th century, outsold anything written by Dickens, outsold Uncle Tom's Cabin, outsold any of the great books of the 19th century. And it allowed him to really set down the story from his own point of view. It wasn't all true by any means. It was very much the subjective sense of what he thought he was about, but that is essential, and it was vital in making the myth what it turned into. And so I think that's one of the first things. The next is that he managed to, whilst he was on St. Helena, and of course there were the petty sides. I understand you're going to be hearing about his relationship, his terrible relationship with Sir Hudson Lowe elsewhere, so I'm not going to go into that. But there was the small and petty side, but there was also a much more petty on Hudson Lowe's side than Napoleon's, I hasten to add. But they dragged each other down. But there was also the magnificent side, the side where one had a sense that he had to go to that island, he had to be sent to that island, because otherwise he might have escaped again. And so I do support the Liverpool government's decision to send him off to that tiny island bang in the middle of the Atlantic like that, because they wouldn't have done it had the 100 days not taken place. And some 100,000 people were killed or wounded on both sides in the 100 days. And so one can perfectly understand the British government wanting to make sure that he could never escape again. And why? The answer is, of course, that he was this extraordinary protean figure. Ironically, he wasn't to be for very much longer after Waterloo because, of course, he caught cancer. But nonetheless, the sheer concept that if he were allowed to do what he wanted to do, which was to stay like Themistocles, as he put it, in the home counties for the rest of his life, that he would always pose a threat. And why did he pose a threat? And the answer is not just because of French nationalism, but because of the ideas that he represented. Primarily, I think the idea of meritocracy is the one that he personified in St Helena at a time when the whole of the rest of Europe, between 1815 and 1821, was returning to reaction, including the Liverpool government in Britain. And yet he was somebody who, not necessarily because of his own life, he was born an aristocrat after all, but because of what he did and what he believed in, he allowed people, especially of course in the French army, to become marshals and therefore counts and dukes and princes, and on 2 occasions kings, from backgrounds that had never produced these kind of aristocrats before. He was able, people who in those days when he took over before the French Revolution, when he was a lieutenant, but specifically once he'd taken over as first consul in 1799, people could get into positions of responsibility and therefore power and wealth who had never, their families had never had them before, not in 1,000 years of French history. And that therefore is an extraordinarily liberating concept, one that I think that we need to still hang on to today, the idea that one's talents, one's abilities, one's intelligence, one's risk-taking really was the criteria on which one should be judged, as opposed to merely who one's father was or grandfather or so on. So this is something that, of course, comes out very strongly in the Napoleon ethic. One sees it at Les Invalides. But I think without St Helena, and without his opportunity to set that out in his memorial of St Helena, would not be with us today, would not be such a powerful concept in European thought and European history. So good luck to you, the Bicentenary Trust. I hope it's a tremendous success. 2021 is going to be a great year, I think, for Napoleonic studies and for everything that you're doing. And thank you very much.
My warm greetings to everyone in London and beyond at the launch of Napoleon 200. I'm Philip Rushbrook, the present-day Governor of Saint Helena, and I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to offer my support to the new trust that's being set up and to the event today. This new campaign is a wonderful initiative and one that is of the moment. With the bicentenary of the passing of Napoleon in May 2021, this is exactly the right time for this sort of event to take place. The bicentenary will be part of the vanguard that ensures the occasion is remembered and the physical legacy endures for the future of the people of Saint Helena. Saint Helena and Britain have had a long and entwined history since Captain John Dutton became the first governor in 1659. In all of that intervening period, the most important defining moment of the history of the island has been that 6 years when Napoleon came to Saint Helena. He was and still is the most prominent resident ever to have been on this island. A truly larger-than-life character whose impact remains with the community today. Whilst the circumstances of Napoleon's time on the island were unusual to say the least, the writing of Saint Helena's history has been permanently influenced by his presence. Here on Saint Helena, we are fortunate. Every day we are able to see the visit, all the reminders of Napoleon's time here. Longwood House, the Briars Pavilion, and the tomb in the beautiful Seine Valley. But there is much more to it than just these structures. The wealth of personal and social history from the time that Napoleon was here has now entered into the folklore and consciousness of the islands. The relationship he had with the Balkan family, the tense interplay between Napoleon and the then governor Hudson Lowe, and also the cat and mouse and horseback adventures that Napoleon had with islanders when he was allowed to travel around the island. Now, as we approach Napoleon 200, the 200th anniversary, next May the 5th, this initiative that you have joined in today is absolutely vital to make sure and to achieve success. To ensure the legacy of Napoleon's time on Saint Helena is more than just an affectionate memory in school books and tours. It is to commence nothing more than a new era of recognition, one that builds on the legacy of the past, but also contributes to the development of the community on Saint Helena in the future. The Napoleon 200 campaign is precisely what we need to sustain the memory of the Napoleonic period on Saint Helena. Both its history, of what happened whilst he was here, but also alongside providing facilities and services for the 21st century. I'm also pleased to learn that there is interest from around the world in the bicentenary events, so this really is an example of global Britain in action. So thank you, each and every one of you, for your support to Napoleon 200. I encourage you to help to achieve its fundraising targets for the restoration of historic sites and the development of educational trails, and I hope those can become a reality very soon. So please make contact with James Bramble. His email is james@napoleon200.org, and please offer your talents and your support and get involved. Above all, you will not be disappointed in together what we can achieve. Thank you, and I look forward to a successful future of Napoleon 200.
I'm Michel d'Antoine Martineau, and the director of the French properties on Saint Helena Island. On the occasion of the commemoration of the Emperor Napoleon's death, I wish you all a warm welcome to the launch of the British Napoleonic Bicentenary Trust. Require any more information about the trust itself or the project that the trust is leading on, like Toby's Cottage, please do not hesitate to ask James tonight. He will be more than happy to answer all your questions.
Good evening. My name is Kettle Warboys, and I'm the Saint Helena Government UK representative and a trustee of the British Napoleonic Bicentenary Trust. Saint Helena remains relatively unknown in the wider world, and for many who have heard of the island, it is usually because of Napoleon. You could say it was Napoleon who put Saint Helena on the map. The Napoleonic era is an important part of the island's history. You've heard that the Trust will fundraise for two priority projects. Toby's Cottage, a building at the Briars which house the Balkan family slaves, and a new heritage trail. Toby's Cottage will add a new dimension to the visitor and islanders' experience. Saint Helena played an important role in the abolition of slavery. Many of the liberated slaves remained on the island, and it is an important part of our cultural identity and history, which we should all embrace. The Heritage Trail will greatly add to the educational aspect and enable people to experience the island virtually, and hopefully whet their appetite to visit in person. I appeal to everyone, but particularly to my fellow saints, to get involved and support us in any way you can to make this a successful project that we can all be proud to say we were part of. Thank you.
Thank you to Andrew, Philip, Michelle and Kedal for those messages of support. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Sir Brian Unwin, previously head of the European Investment Bank, author of Terrible Exile, The Last Days of Napoleon on Saint Helena, and our chair of trustees. Over to you, Sir Brian.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. We had intended to have a face-to-face launch when we could have offered you a glass of something to lubricate your interest, but I'm afraid we can't do that, and I found no means of giving you a virtual drink. So things are what they are. Now, you've heard James explain the genesis and the purpose of the trust and what we're seeking to achieve. You've heard Andrew Roberts, the distinguished historian, talking about the important legacy of Saint Helena for the understanding of Napoleon. And you've heard the messages from His Excellency the Governor and Kedal, and Michel Martineau, the French representative on the island who rules over Longwood House, where Napoleon lived and died. So I'll try not to repeat any of that, but what I would like to do is to say one or two things about Saint Helena itself, and also about Napoleon's period on the island. Now, Saint Helena is an incredible, wonderful island, a very remote one, as you know, stuck out there in the middle of the Atlantic, 1,000 miles or more from West Africa, and about double that from South America on the other side. The nearest inhabited island is Ascension Island, about 800 miles away. And it always amused me when I was on Saint Helena that people talked about nearby Ascension Island, as if it were like the Isle of Wight or Anglesey. So it's very remote. And until last year or so, you could only go there by sea. And the only scheduled voyages were on the old Royal Mail steamship Saint Helena, which has now been allowed to go into gentle retirement since an airport has been built. But I'm afraid it's a question of catch-22. The airport was operating, but now it has not operated since the beginning of the year because of the COVID epidemic. But let me say a little more about Saint Helena. It's a very exciting island. It has dramatic maritime and inland scenery. You have rugged volcanic cliffs on the one hand, and in the interior, a surprisingly green and mountainous island. It's a tiny island, less than 50 square miles in its surface coverage. But the highest points on the island go nearly as high as the highest mountain in England. It has a great deal to offer. It has wonderful flora and fauna. There are maritime birds. There's for the bird watchers, the very rare wirebird on the island, and rare endemic flora such as the male and female cabbage trees and other plants that are only found on Saint Helena. It really packs a very big punch for such a small place. And it also has a wealth of Georgian architecture. The main little town, the capital, if you like, Jamestown, is a gem of a Georgian village which you won't find anywhere else on the world. So there is so much on Saint Helena. And if, like me, you're a passionate cricket fan, you will also find very competitive cricket on Saint Helena. And I was delighted to find the other day in the latest ICC World Cricket Test rankings that Saint Helena is actually 5 places in the merit order above China. And given the disparity in population, I think that's a remarkable achievement. But I'm not sure how many in China play cricket. But against all this, the reason that most people know about Saint Helena is, of course, the fact that Napoleon was there as a guest of the British government for 5.5 years or so. And let me now say a bit about Napoleon and his stay there. It really is an incredibly dramatic story. As I think Andrew Roberts said, it has all the ingredients of a classic Aristotelian Greek tragedy. It has a beginning, a middle, and the end, and it depicts the fall of a very great man from the very highest estate to low estate. So let me say a bit more about Napoleon and how he got there and what he did there. After the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon went back to Paris. He was asked by the provisional government in Paris to leave. He went to the West Coast, to Rochefort, and after long hesitation and deliberation, he finally put himself in the hands of the Royal Navy. And he was conveyed to Rochefort, over to Plymouth, on the good ship, the warship Bellerophon, known by the sailors on board as the Billy Ruffian. He was left aboard at Plymouth for 2 or 3 weeks while the British government under Lord Liverpool decided what to do with him. And they decided to send him to Saint Helena. So he was put up on another warship, the Northumberland, and off they went to Saint Helena. And Napoleon had a large retinue with him. He had 35 or 40 faithful followers with him, among whom were 3 full generals: General Bertrand, the master of the imperial court, with his feisty wife, Fanny Bertrand. I'll say a bit more about her in a moment. General Montalon and his wife, the rather sexy Albine de Montalon, and General Gourgaud, who had been with Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo and at the terrible Russian campaign. He also had a very high-ranking civilian, Emmanuel de Lascars, who was in effect his amanuensis, and a whole retinue of faithful valets and servants and equerries and cooks and so on. And they all went off on the Northumberland to Saint Helena. When they got there, they were housed, after an initial stay in a temporary place, they were housed in Longwood House in the middle of the island. And of course, for all Napoleon's supporters, this was not a holiday island at all. To them, it was a terrible place to be sent to. And if I may be a little vulgar in French, Fanny Bertrand, the wife of General Bertrand, described Saint Helena herself as une île que le diable a chié en volant d'un monde à l'autre. And I leave you to translate that. But Napoleon's retinue were housed in Longwood House in the center of the island. It wasn't very grand compared with the Élysée or the Schönbrunn Palace, the places where Napoleon had previously stayed. It was in effect a rather tarted up and expanded farmhouse, but it was damp and it was windy and it was much of the time rat infested. But Napoleon and all his followers, except some of the slaves who worked for them, were crowded into Longwood House. And this was the center of Napoleon's existence for the next 5.5 years. And of course, the days were interminably long. And Napoleon, who had throughout his life lived such a highly charged and busy life, Napoleon had to find something to occupy these long days. And he did so by dictating, incessantly dictating, mainly to Emmanuel de Lascars, because Napoleon was very anxious that his own account of his career should be the one that posterity should have before them. He spent a lot of time organizing the household. He was very anxious to maintain the dignity of an imperial court, despite the very small number of people there. So every night they dined in full dress uniforms and observed all the formalities. He also spent a great deal of his time and energy fighting, protesting, and arguing against the restrictions that were placed on him. Because let there be no doubt, he was not being housed in a comfortable holiday house and island. He was a prisoner. Indeed, 2,000 troops had been sent out to stay on the island and to help keep him there. And together with them went a new governor, General Sir Hudson Lowe, who was not a greatly distinguished soldier, but had had quite a reasonable career. And his mission, his task from the government in London was to make sure that Napoleon did not escape. Now, Napoleon couldn't stand him. And when they met amazingly only 6 times during the first year of Hudson Lowe's governorship there. And the meetings became more and more acrimonious as they went along. Napoleon couldn't stand the sight of the governor. He argued against the restrictions placed on him, the restrictions on his movement, the restrictions on what he could spend, and so on. But one thing I think annoyed and upset Napoleon more than anything else, which perhaps looks a small thing, but to Napoleon it was of enormous importance. Hudson Lowe had been instructed to address Napoleon as General Bonaparte, not the Emperor, but General Bonaparte. And so this fell into an absurd situation. When, for example, Hudson Lowe sent an invitation to Napoleon to come to some event at the government house, it was addressed to General Bonaparte. The governor then got a reply saying, "Very sorry, we don't know any general, no one of that address known here." And in the same way, when Napoleon instructed one of his generals to reply to the governor and maybe sent a message saying, "Your Excellency, His Majesty the Emperor has asked me to notify you that so-and-so," the governor would send it back saying, "I'm terribly sorry, we're not aware of any emperor on the island." And so these things grew and grew and grew. And the atmosphere between the two became absolutely charged. And Napoleon in the end said, "I will not see the governor again." He refused to see him and indeed indicated that he would have pistols already loaded in his rooms at Longwood. So if anyone came to try and to force entry to him, he would use them. And as the years went on, the strain on Napoleon was tremendous. I think he gradually realized that he was not ever going to leave the island. At first he hoped that the British government or the other European governments would relent and let him go back to Europe. But I think he realized over time that it was the end and he was going to remain there. And he began to deteriorate physically and psychologically. He became more and more ill. His legs swelled, his gums bled, he had stomach pains. And in the last year, he was very sick indeed. And the end came in May 1821, which is the bicentenary that we are commemorating. He died surrounded by his faithful followers, that is, those of them who had not already left the island, but General Bertrand, Fanny Bertrand, General Montholon were there. And he died on the 5th of May, 1821. And he was given the best funeral that the island could muster, with great pomp, with all the troops there. And he was buried on the island in a beautiful little glade called Geranium Valley, which you can visit now, and buried deep in a tomb. In fact, in 3 coffins, a tin plate one, a mahogany one, and a lead one. I think the governor was still wanted to make quite sure that he wouldn't escape then. But later, in 1840, the British government agreed that he should be exhumed, and in great state he was taken back to Paris and buried in a magnificent tomb, which many of you may know, at Les Invalides. So we think it absolutely right that the death of such a man of profound legacy and influence, not just for France and Britain, but for the whole of Europe, should be commemorated in the way we are proposing. We want to investigate that legacy, and we also want, and Dan Cruickshank will tell you much more about this, we want to help restore and preserve some of the physical monuments and legacy on Saint Helena connected with Napoleon, which are in danger of going into decay, and where we risk losing them. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I've whetted your appetite a bit further and that you will stay with us, and maybe, as James said, maybe you might be inclined to give us some support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Brian, for that fantastic presentation. Okay, and now I'd like to hand over to Dan Cruickshank, author, historian, TV presenter, man of many talents. Dan, over to you.
Hello, James. Thank you. Good, excellent. Hello out there, the world. Well, the Trust is supporting works at a number of key locations on Saint Helena to help tell the story of Napoleon's exile on the island. But as well as telling Napoleon's story, the selected sites will also reveal the British government's determination to keep Napoleon confined, alienated from the world, and politically harmless. In addition, the sites offer a portrait of the daily life that 200 years ago was lived on this tiny and remote tropical island. Saint Helena had been discovered by the Portuguese in the very early 16th century and became a British possession in 1657, very early in expansion of the British Empire, I suppose, when Oliver Cromwell granted the East India Company a charter to govern the island and put it to productive use. From the start, Saint Helena's economy was founded on slavery. A census of 1723 records that of the 1,110 people then living on the island, 610 were slaves. When Napoleon arrived on St. Helena in October 1815, he stayed first at the Briars Pavilion. He evidently liked the look of the place because he asked to be billeted there, while Longwood, his designated future home, was being prepared. The occupant of the Briars, William Balcombe, readily agreed to Napoleon's request. Balcombe had arrived on the island in 1805 and was employed by the East India Company to provision its ships. It's not known whether Balcombe had built the Briars or acquired it with the estate, but it was in existence in 1805 when the future Duke of Wellington, by extraordinary coincidence, stayed in the pavilion when in transit between India and Britain. Napoleon stayed at the Briars for a very brief period. He left on the 10th of December 1815, but during that time he became very friendly with the Balcombe family, particularly with William's 14-year-old daughter, Betsy. She was, I believe, one of the few people on the island who could speak decent French. The sustained relationship between Napoleon and the Balcombes caused the island's governor, Hudson Lowe, considerable anxiety after he arrived in St. Helena in early 1816. He was in constant fear that Napoleon might escape, as Brian has pointed out, and Lowe finally became almost obsessively suspicious of the Balcombes, the poor things, and they were obliged to leave the island by his orders in 1818. During the 7 weeks or so that Napoleon lodged at the Briars, he would have become familiar with the island's slave-based economy. The Balcombes had 29 slaves, but typical and unfortunate, we do not know their names, we don't know where they came from, where they were abducted from, or where they were bought, except for one exception. This exception is a slave named Toby. His story is fascinating, not least because it can help the Trust tell the wider and most important story of the slaves who lived, worked, and died on St. Helena. And it can do much to place the significant history of slavery in St. Helena in the context of Napoleon and his exile. Toby was a Malay who'd been abducted by a ship's captain and carried to St. Helena, where he was sold into slavery. In 1815, he was aged and working at the Briars, still a slave, of course, in charge of the Balcombes' beautiful garden. Napoleon seems to have observed Toby at work and to have admired him. Presumably, he envied his quiet calm and quite calm, his dignity, even his philosophic resignation to his condition. It became Napoleon's habit when strolling in the gardens to stop and chat to Toby, asking him about his distant homeland and his life of slavery. No doubt they developed a bond. Both men had been brought unwillingly to the island, both were imprisoned, and both seemed doomed to die there. Napoleon had perhaps brooded on the role death might play in their imprisonment, his imprisonment and Toby's imprisonment. It could provide, of course, an honourable release. Toby observed that, quote Bonaparte, that Toby had been a Brutus, that if Toby had been a Brutus, he would have put himself to death rather than endure a life in bondage. But Napoleon, like Brutus, was a general defeated in a decisive battle, and like Toby was facing a future of imprisonment. But Napoleon chose not to fall on his sword. He must have considered his epic heroic death from time to time. But something he said to Betsy Balcombe seems to reveal how he resolved the issue. He had teased her for crying over being confined to her bedroom for some childish misdemeanor. She was nettled and accused him, Napoleon, of crying over his fate. He admitted he had cried, but told her that the prison remains nevertheless, so it is better to be occupied and cheerful. Perhaps Napoleon had learned this philosophic resolve from contemplating Toby tending his garden patiently and without bitterness. Napoleon wanted to do all in his power to change Toby's fate. He offered to buy him, to set him free and send him home. Hudson Lowe, rather predictably, prevented this act of kindness. Ever suspicious of Napoleon and his motives, Lowe observed, it is not only Toby that General Bonaparte wants to liberate to please Miss Balcombe. He wants to gain the gratitude of all the Negroes on the island. Extraordinary. Was Lowe so convinced of Napoleon's charismatic power to inspire that he feared he might stir up an insurrection amongst the slave population? Toby was grateful for Napoleon's offer and duly became a devotee of the emperor. Betsy recorded in her journal that, to quote Betsy, when the nights were illuminated by the splendid tropical moon, Napoleon would rise at 3 o'clock and saunter down to the garden and there regale himself with an early breakfast of delicious fruits. Made possible because Toby always placed the garden key when Napoleon's fingers could reach it. No one else, she observed, was ever favoured in this manner, but the emperor had completely fascinated and won the old man's heart. This, of course, was one of Napoleon's great talents. When he left Briars, Napoleon gave Toby 20 gold Napoleons, and in return, Toby showed his respect, gratitude, even devotion, by regularly delivering flowers and fruit to Longwood for, as Toby said, that good man Boney. Napoleon reflected that Toby was the victim of an atrocious crime. This man, after all, Napoleon told that his family, his happiness, and his liberty had been taken from him, and it was a horrible act of cruelty to bring him here to languish in the fetters of slavery. But it would be a mistake to see Napoleon as simply an enlightened romantic. He was a political pragmatist characterized by was complex and often seemingly inconsistent. Slavery in the French colonies was abolished in 1794 as the revolutionary principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity were exported abroad. But in 1802, Napoleon, when first consul, reinstated slavery in the Martinique and other West Indian colonies because he saw this as being, at the time and in the circumstances, in France's best economic and military interest. Also, in 1802, for similar reasons, he ordered an invasion, ultimately unsuccessful, of Haiti, where in 1792 an insurrection and by self-liberated slaves had established an independent state. So we have to put context, create a context to understand Napoleon's regard for Toby. Napoleon died, as you know, on Saint Helena in May 1821. There's no record of Toby's death. Perhaps he was alive in 1818 when Hudson Lowe initiated the emancipation of the island's 800 resident slaves by ordering that all slave children born after Christmas that year should, at a certain age, be granted their freedom. Or indeed, if Toby lived to 1834, which seems, I suppose, unlikely, he would have died a free man. But what does survive, well documented and certain and very moving, are the ruined remains of Toby's cottage. The Trust proposal is to repair the cottage in an authentic manner and return it to its original state with compressed earth floor and simple kitchen goods as a memorial to Toby, the simple man that the emperor admired, and to show, of course, the life of a slave on Saint Helena. The story of the fallen emperor and the slave and the apparent respect each had for the other has a touch of the sublime about it. As with so much of Napoleon's life, it's like a page from a fabulous fable, touching on the elemental, the noble, the heroic, on hubris and the reversal of fortune. Napoleon's rise to tumultuous heights of power and his rapid fall, to end his days as a prisoner on a remote island with a slave for a companion, has the quality, as Brian has pointed out, of a Greek or indeed a Jacobean tragedy. It's like a weird reworking of the Tempest. Something of this fantastic and timeless tale that reveals yet another facet of Napoleon's character will be told by the cottage. For those not able to visit St Helena to see the cottage, the Trust will work with the Oxford XR Hub to develop a virtual model of the building, documenting its current state and showing works as they proceed. In this way, the project will be an educational resource available to the entire world regarding slavery on St Helena. There are other additional locations on the island which interest the Trust greatly. I mean, there are many other historic buildings and sites on the island with the Trust could work. The Briars Pavilion and Longwood House are owned by the French government and are well maintained and presented. But there are others, other structures and sites now desperately in need of attention and conservation. These include some that would be known to Napoleon, but also sites of outstanding importance that were altered or constructed after his time. These include Munden's Battery, Banks Battery, Coburn's Battery, and the spectacular High Knoll Fort. The island is indeed studded with batteries that teeter precariously over the island's cliff edges, each a fine example of Georgian military engineering, and many still retaining their original ordnance. But I say the Trust's priority is to work with Toby's cottage and to develop a heritage trail to help guide visitors to the sites and to explain their significance. Please get in touch with the Trust. You can offer support as a volunteer, a fundraiser, or a coordinator. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so we will now go to a question and answer session. So please do send any questions you might have via the chat function on the right-hand side of the screen, which Alex will then send to me. We have about 10 minutes left of the hour, so we can answer those questions over the next 10 minutes. I think the question that I am asked most commonly when I explain the bicentenary, and it is the thing which sticks in people's imagination about Napoleon on Saint Helena, for good or for bad, is the accusation that he was poisoned and that his death was brought about by poisoning. So can I put that to you, Dan, and you, Brian? Perhaps starting with you, Brian, because I know you have researched this for your book. How true, or what is the truth behind the accusation that Napoleon was poisoned on Saint Helena?
I don't think there's any truth in it. When Napoleon died, after an agonizing time, there was an autopsy carried out by his own doctor who'd been sent out from Corsica to treat him. And the autopsy showed, I think, almost without doubt, that he had a serious cancer of the stomach. I think it's known technically as a sclerosis carcinoma. And Napoleon's father is said to have died of stomach cancer also. There are all kinds of reports and rumors about arsenic poisoning. It's alleged there was arsenic in the wallpaper at Longwood House, or that someone had fed Napoleon arsenic. But I think nearly all historians now are agreed that Napoleon died of stomach cancer. There have been tests on his hair, taken samples of Napoleon's hair, taken at taken from different periods of his life, and indeed they've showed a very high arsenic content. But I think other tests on contemporaries of Napoleon have shown that they too, most people had a very, very much higher arsenic content than is the case now, because arsenic was used for many purposes. Indeed, it was present in the paint in the wallpaper. It was used in cosmetics and for many other purposes. So I think it's almost certain, we can't be absolutely certain, but it's almost certain that Napoleon died an extremely unpleasant and painful death from stomach cancer and not from arsenic poisoning.
Thank you very much. Dan, did you want to add anything to that?
No. I mean, I also, I mean, reading all the latest research and opinions, that's absolutely right. Brian's absolutely correct. That seems to be the case. I mean, there was obviously this sort of conspiracy theory 20 years ago that somehow he had been poisoned either by the British or by Bourbon French. We do not know, but it seems much more straightforward. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? That time there was this idea of analysing the hair that then discovered there was much arsenic in it, but now we understand that generally people have much more arsenic in their hair, like 100 times more than that now deemed to be acceptable. So that evidence was really, not relevant. He just seems to have been. I mean, I think it was also his father. Did his father not die of stomach cancer? It seems to be genetic to the degree. So I think unless anyone comes up with new information that is piercing and penetrating and important, we have to conclude that poor Napoleon died of stomach cancer.
Thank you. Okay, Delphine Jasmine Bilal, hello Delphine, asks, can you tell us more about the volunteer roles? That's something that I can answer. So we're going to be organising a series of commemorative events, as I say, in the UK, in France, potentially also in the US, Australia, and even Russia. Those locations are chosen because many of the protagonists, if we can call them that, in the story of Napoleon on Saint Helena are buried in those locations. And we would like to lay a small plaque at each of those grave sites, if that's possible, and organise a small commemorative event at each of those grave sites. The size of the event will obviously be dictated by COVID restrictions. So they may be very small events if we're only allowed to assemble 6 people in one place at that time. But we're looking for individuals who can help us organise those events and play a role in those events and help shape what those events actually are, because this is very much a collaborative effort. We're looking for people to get on board who have an interest in this, to help us shape what the bicentenary is, and just to help us out in whichever way they would like to, really. So I'd put the call out again. If you're interested in helping, please email me at james@napoleon200.org. And I'd love to have a conversation with you about how you might be able to help. We have 5 minutes left. Please do send any additional questions you might have, and I will relate them to Sir Brian and Dan. Perhaps one additional question is, why Saint Helena? Why was Napoleon sent to Saint Helena of all places? There are other remote locations he could have been sent. Why was Saint Helena chosen? Dan, would you like to start with that?
Well, I mean, no, over Brian, I think, is more authority on this. It was obviously after it seems rather evident to me after the escape from Elba. It was he had to go somewhere very remote, so he couldn't happen again. I mean, surely that is the simple answer. I mean, there were other things were considered at the time, but the British authority decided Napoleon could not be trusted, and he had to be put somewhere where he could be guarded, and getting away or releasing him was extremely difficult, particularly, I suppose, a long way as far as possible from. I mean, obviously the threat seemed to be coming from the United States. So, you know, there could be liberation there from that quarter. I mean, I suppose that is no more to it than that. Unless Brian has other insights on it.
Well, I think. Sorry, as Dan says, it was the obvious place to put Napoleon. The British government at the time couldn't take any risks at all. Napoleon himself, in an astonishing letter on his way over to Plymouth on the Billy Ruffian, sent a letter to the Prince Regent asking for asylum in a comfortable country house somewhere in the UK. But I think the Liverpool government did not think they could take any risks at all. And of course, they knew Saint Helena very well, because at the time, although it's now a Crown property, it was owned by the powerful East India Company. And before the construction of the Suez Canal, it was a very regular watering place. British ships who were traveling to the Cape or round to India called in at Saint Helena for fresh water and fresh supplies. So it was very well known, and it was known to be such an impregnable place. I mean, if you go there, there are 400-500 feet volcanic cliffs on all sides. There are no proper beaches. It really is an absolute fortress. So I think actually, when the cabinet were considering this, the suggestion of Saint Helena came from one of the principal civil servants at the Admiralty, because the Admiralty knew it well. And I think that's why they chose it. And of course, it was chosen later as a prison island in other contexts. In the Boer War, there were large numbers of Boer prisoners were put on the island, in fact, in what were early concentration camps. So it was the obvious place to put Napoleon.
Thank you, Sir Brian. Kate Pugh, hello Kate, says, can you say something about your fundraising target and the timescale? So the target for Toby's Cottage is £100,000. That costing has been prepared based upon the scans produced by Brent Fortenberry and costed by Avison Young and Webb Yates. So we're confident that that's a sound budget to return Toby's Cottage to the state that it would have been when Toby and perhaps other slaves lived in it. So our target for Toby's Cottage is £100,000. The Heritage Trail, we're working to a budget of £50,000 to that, which is essentially to renovate some of the pathways and to install interpretation signage at a series of the main sites on St. Helena, so that a visitor to those sites can understand those buildings in their context. Currently, a visitor to St. Helena would have to have a guidebook or to read up on the literature to understand the history of those buildings. So we'd like to have interpretation signage and also make those sites a little bit safer to visit. Those are our two main priorities at the moment: 100,000 for Toby's, 50,000 for the Heritage Trail. There are, of course, other projects, as we've alluded to through this presentation, and we do have costings for those. Again, thanks to Brent, Avison Young and Webb Yates. But we're focusing on those two at the moment because we have scaled back our ambition a little bit to be a bit more modest in the context of coronavirus. You ask about the timescale, and essentially that is as long as it takes to raise that funding. It's very difficult to anticipate how long it will take to raise funding for a capital heritage project at the moment. But we are launching our campaign today, and we hope to raise that £150,000 as soon as possible over over the coming years, I would imagine, but perhaps not. Perhaps we will be successful or more successful than we're anticipating. It is now 7 o'clock, so I will finish up by saying thank you very much to all of our speakers, to everyone who's dialed into this, well, I would say slightly unusual event, but this is perhaps the new normal, so I'm sure we've all been on a few of these events, but thank you for joining us. Please do, as I say, go to www.napoleon200.org to find out more information. Please sign up to the mailing list or you won't hear any more from us about our upcoming events. Please consider how you might be able to support us, whether that's by making a donation or becoming a volunteer in some form or other. Please email me at james@napoleon200.org if you're interested in helping any other way. And please, very importantly, please share the details of this appeal with your friends, with your networks. This is our launch. We're just starting out. We need to get the word out to as many people as possible, including in other countries, US, Australia, Russia, France, of course. So please do spread the word as much as you can. We need all the help we can get. So please do think what you can do to help us. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.